It was supposed to be a simple celebration balloons cake, and the familiar din of laughter echoing off the kitchen walls. My daughter had invited everyone for our youngest grandson's birthday, and though the air smelled of frosting and grilled chicken, something in the atmosphere felt off from the moment I stepped through the door. It wasn't anything loud or overt. In fact, it was the opposite, a kind of vacancy, like someone had taken a piece of the room out and hoped no one would notice. They had set the table for 10, but there were 11 guests. I stood there for a long second, scanning the faces and then down to the chairs. One was clearly a spare pulled awkwardly from the hallway. Not matched, not meant. And it was the one they offered me. I smiled, of course. Smiled like all mothers do when they know they're supposed to be grateful, when they're too tired to make a fuss, too old to be dramatic. I sat careful not to scrape the wooden floor, careful not to wrinkle the tablecloth with the hem of my coat. The laughter rolled on. The children chased balloons, the men cracked open beers, and I folded my napkin into smaller and smaller squares, just to keep my hands busy. They passed around gifts and complimented the potato salad, and all the while, I felt like I was sitting in someone else's memory, like I didn't belong to the moment, only to the background. What struck me most wasn't what they said, it was what they didn't. No one asked how I'd been. No one noticed the knitted shawl I'd spent 3 months finishing, which I wrapped in brown paper and set quietly on the gift table. No one mentioned the scarf I'd made for my grandson, even as he tore open box after box of plastic battery-operated noisemakers. His mother, the one I raised with both my hands and my heart, didn't look in my direction once. Not when I came in. Not when I left. Not even when I whispered happy birthday to her son and kissed him on the head. I left before the candles were blown out. I said I had a headache, but the truth was, my presence felt like a burden, and I couldn't bear to be the shadow at someone else's celebration. As I stepped outside, the air hit colder than I remembered. The sun was still warm on my skin, but it didn't reach my bones. I stood by the car for a moment, wondering when the shift had happened, when I'd gone from being the center of the family to something more like a seasonal decoration, something taken out now and then, something easily forgotten once the lights go out. In the rearview mirror, I caught one last glance at the house. The windows were glowing, full of movement and sound and people, and not a single one of them noticed I was gone. I hadn't meant to linger by the fence, but my hands were trembling too much to drive. It wasn't just the ache behind my eyes. It was that numb, crawling feeling you get when you've accidentally touched something too cold for too long, like I'd overstayed some invisible welcome. I leaned against the hood of the car, catching my breath, pretending I was only checking my purse for keys I already knew were there. That's when I heard it, his voice. My son-in-law. They thought I had left. The kitchen window was open just a crack, and his voice drifted through like smoke from a fire that hadn't quite died. "I told you this would happen," he said, sharp but low. "She's always around, like we can't just have one damn day without her showing up uninvited." My heart didn't skip. It sank, slow, heavy, like it had been waiting for the blow. My daughter didn't respond right away. I held my breath, waiting, hoping for her to say something. Anything. She's just trying to help, maybe. Or, it's her grandson, too. But silence filled the pause, and that was its own kind of answer. Finally, she said something I couldn't quite catch. It was softer, maybe ashamed, but the damage was already done. The truth, like steam, doesn't go back into the kettle. I sat down hard in the driver's seat. My knees didn't feel like they could hold me up anymore. I had always known he didn't care for me. That much had been clear from the beginning. Too many eye rolls when I offered to help, too many side glances when I corrected the kids' manners, or when I brought a second casserole just in case they didn't have enough food. I thought I was being thoughtful. Maybe I was. But he saw me as interference, a ghost in their new life. Still to hear it so plainly showing up uninvited as if I were some stray cat scratching at the back door. That wasn't just rude. That was a rewriting of history. I hadn't shown up. I was asked. The text was still on my phone. Mom, come at 2. Bring the lemon pie if you can. I brought 2. I always bring 2. I didn't cry. Not then. I just sat there staring through the windshield, hearing my own breath and the faraway laughter of my grandchildren. I thought about how many birthdays I'd hosted for my daughter, how many cakes I'd baked from scratch, how many times I stayed up sewing costumes or calming her through fevers. I thought about the years when I couldn't afford to buy her presents. So I made them crocheted, animals, paper dolls, painted picture frames, with our names carved into the wood. And now, after everything, I was a ghost at the table, a problem to manage, a chair they forgot to count. I drove away slowly, careful not to make the tires crunch too loudly on the gravel. I didn't want them to know I'd heard. Part of me still clung to the idea that maybe I had misunderstood, that maybe there was something else he meant. But in my heart, I knew. Words like that aren't accidental. Disdain, when it grows long enough, finds a voice. When I got home, I put the leftover pie in the fridge, though I knew I wouldn't eat it. I took off my shoes and stood in the hallway, staring at the old photographs lined up like centuries, weddings, graduations, birthdays. All those moments I had helped build frame by frame. And still, somehow I was no longer welcome in the house I had spent my life helping to make a home. That night the house was too quiet. Even the ticking of the clock seemed reluctant to keep me company. I poured myself a cup of tea, but it cooled before I could drink it. I just sat there, one hand wrapped around the warm ceramic, the other pressed against my chest like I was trying to hold something in place, something that had started to crack. Something I wasn't ready to let go of yet. The next time I saw them, it was at a Sunday brunch. My daughter said it would be just a small thing, something lighthearted at a cafe not far from where they lived. She made it sound like an afterthought, as though inviting me were part of some list she remembered at the last minute. If you're free, she said on the phone, her voice thin and hurried. I told her I was, even though I wasn't sure I should go. But I did. I showed up with a scarf I'd been knitting for her youngest, a soft sky blue, wrapped with a paper flower I'd made out of old sheet music. I still believed back then that gestures mattered. The place was bright, all modern lighting and loud espresso machines. The waitress sat me at the end of the table, not in the middle like I used to be. That simple detail lodged in my chest like a splinter. At first glance, everyone was all smiles. My daughter gave me a side hug and said, "Glad you made it," like it was a surprise I had. My son-in-law gave a nod, barely looking up from his phone. The children were already deep into their juice and pancakes, barely noticing me. And so I sat listening, watching slowly fading into the wallpaper of their new life. They talked about renovations, new vacation plans, the latest upgrade on the car, small talk polished to hide what wasn't said. No one asked me how I was doing. No one even noticed when I didn't finish my food. I felt like I was floating just outside the glass, like I could see them but wasn't really part of them. I tried to contribute, mentioned a new book I'd read, a funny memory from when my daughter was in school. But each time I spoke, it felt like the conversation paused for a polite beat and then moved right past me like a river diverting around a stone. No argument, no drama, just a quiet dismissal. It's harder sometimes when the cruelty is subtle. You start to wonder if you're imagining it. You begin to second-guess every gesture, every word, until the silence starts to feel like proof. At one point, I noticed the way my daughter glanced at her husband after I said something. Just a flick of her eyes, quick, calculated, cautious. like she was asking permission or bracing for reaction, and he, with that same familiar expression, half amused and half indifferent, just shook his head a little and turned away. That exchange told me everything I needed to know. My daughter had been folding herself into someone else's shape for so long she'd forgotten the lines of her own, and in that folding I had been slowly pressed out. They left before I did. My daughter hugged me again, light as tissue. "We'll call," she said, but the call never came. I lingered a while at the table, sipping cold coffee, staring at the syrup smeared across a paper napkin, like some kind of accidental ink blot. If I squinted, it almost looked like a broken heart. That's the strange thing about grief, not the loud kind that comes from death or disaster, but the quiet kind that comes from erasure. It doesn't hit you all at once. It seeps in slowly like water into wood. You don't notice until something soft inside you starts to rot. On the drive home, I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't need noise. I had plenty of that in my head already, echoes of laughter. I couldn't join in on stories I wasn't part of, conversations I was meant to hear and forget. I looked at the scarf I'd brought still tucked in my purse. I hadn't found the right moment to give it, and now I didn't want to. I'd leave it for another day. Maybe mail it, maybe not. Maybe it was time I stopped trying to earn a seat at a table I had helped build. Because it wasn't that they had said anything outright. It wasn't a blow or an insult I could point to. No, it was the way the smiles came too quickly and left too fast, the way the air stiffened when I spoke, the way I had become in their eyes a presence to endure, not a soul to cherish. And that, I think, is a deeper betrayal than anger. At least with anger you matter enough to provoke it. But indifference is a knife with no handle, nothing to hold on to, and still it cuts. I stopped by her house a few weeks later unannounced. It wasn't something I would normally do, especially not after how things had been. But I had baked too much bread, and I thought maybe, just maybe, the smell of something warm from my kitchen might remind her of the home she came from. Foolish, perhaps, but motherhood does that to you. It leaves a part of you always hoping, even when the evidence says you shouldn't. She answered the door with her hair tied back in that careless knot she used to wear in college apron, still on hands damp from dishwater. For half a second her face flickered with something surprise, maybe, but it dimmed almost instantly, like a match struck in wind. "Oh. Hi," she said, stepping back without really stepping aside. It wasn't a welcome. It was an allowance. She didn't reach for the bread. She didn't smile. She didn't even ask me to sit down. I stood there holding the still warm loaf like a peace offering between strangers. I asked about the kids, and she answered in clipped phrases. "They're fine. School's good." Busy as always. She didn't invite me in. She didn't offer tea. She didn't ask why I came, and worst of all, she wouldn't look at me. Her eyes stayed on the floor, on the counter, on the clock behind my shoulder. Anywhere but mine. And that's when I knew. Not from any grand declaration, not from some climactic argument or thrown words. No, I knew from the way she couldn't meet my gaze, the eyes of a daughter who once clung to me after nightmares, who once cried if I left her sight for more than a moment, now refused to hold mine for even a second. I knew from the way she kept adjusting the dish towel in her hands, as if trying to wring out the guilt she wouldn't say out loud, and I, like a fool, like a mother, just stood there smiling, pretending not to notice the wall she'd built with her silence. "I brought that sourdough you like," I said, finally offering it forward. She took it with both hands, but didn't smell it the way she used to, didn't even glance at the golden crust, just set it down beside the sink like a misplaced receipt. "Thanks," she said, flat and polite. "The kind of thanks you give a mailman." I lingered. I shouldn't have, but I did. Some part of me still believed that maybe if I just waited long enough she'd melt. She'd sigh, shake her head, and pull me into the kitchen with a quiet apology. But minutes stretched, and nothing happened. Eventually I said, "I'll let you get back to your day." She nodded, no protest, no hesitation, just nodded. And as I turned to leave, I said softly, "You used to tell me everything." She didn't respond, didn't blink, just stood there, drying her hands on that same towel. I stepped out onto the porch, the air heavy and still. It was early afternoon, but it felt like dusk. I paused, waiting for her to call out, "Mom, wait," or "Come back." But the door stayed open just wide enough to be awkward, not enough to be an invitation. And as I reached the bottom step, I heard it click, the door closing behind me. It was such a small sound, so ordinary, and yet it rang louder in my ears than any slam ever could. That was the moment something old inside me quietly folded in half, like a letter returned unopened, like a curtain pulled shut. There was no scene, no yelling, just a door, a daughter, and a silence I couldn't fix. On the drive home, I didn't even cry, not right away. I drove past the grocery store we used to walk to when she was little, past the park where she learned to ride a bike, past the corner where she'd once scraped her knee and howled until I kissed it better. So many small places holding pieces of us, but none of them could hold her now. When I finally pulled into my driveway, the tears came. Not sobs, just a slow, steady leak, like rain finding its way through a crack in the roof. Not because she hurt me, but because she wouldn't even look at me long enough to see that she had. That's what betrayal often looks like in families. It's not fire and fury. It's the quiet turning away. It's the bread left uneaten on a counter. It's the way someone can forget the shape of your eyes. The house creaked a little more than usual that night, or maybe it had always creaked that much, and I was just hearing it differently. Funny how silence can be so loud when no one else is around to fill it. I sat at the kitchen table with my mug of chamomile staring at the spot across from me where my late husband used to sit. He always tapped his spoon twice before stirring. It was one of those little habits you only remember after they're gone. 2 quiet taps, then a swirl. I tapped mine twice out of instinct, then laughed under my breath. Old habits, I said aloud, though no one was there to hear me. I looked around the room. Same floral curtains I'd sewn back in the 90s, same chipped teapot on the shelf, same framed picture of my daughter holding her baby for the first time me, just beside her, tired but glowing. I remembered that day, the way she clung to my hand during labor, the way she whispered, "Don't let go, Mom," like I was her anchor. And I hadn't, not once, not then, not after. Through the colic, through her marriage, through every hard season I had shown up even when I wasn't asked. Especially then. Now I was starting to wonder if maybe I shouldn't have. I took another sip of tea, the steam fogging up my glasses. I wiped them with the edge of my sweater and kept thinking about the scarf in my purse, the one I still hadn't mailed. What would be the point? She'd smile, thank me vaguely in a text, maybe never even unwrap it. And I'd feel that small sting again, the kind that doesn't draw blood, but somehow still bruises. I wondered how many more of those little stings I'd endure before I finally stopped offering myself up for them. There's something about getting older that no one really prepares you for. You expect the aching joints, the slower mornings, the names that slip from memory. But no one tells you how hard it is to become invisible to the people you raised, to feel yourself slowly vanish, not because you've changed, but because they have. They build new lives, new rhythms, and suddenly you're not the center of the story anymore. You're a chapter. They skim. I used to cook for them every Sunday. Big meals, roasts, pies, mashed potatoes, fresh bread. The house would be full of laughter, cluttered shoes by the front door, sticky fingers stealing dessert early. I lived for that noise. I had cupboards full of mismatched Tupperware, each one with a label in black marker. For Jess, for the kids, extra gravy. That was my love language. Feeding, giving, staying late to clean, packing them food for the week. And then one Sunday they just stopped coming. No explanation, no fight. Just, oh, we've got plans, and maybe next week, until weeks turned into months. I still cooked sometimes out of habit. Still caught myself checking the driveway at noon. Still folded napkins in sets of 6 instead of 1. I'd find myself halfway through setting the table before I remembered there's no one coming. That night, after finishing my tea, I opened the fridge and stared into it. Half a pie, leftover stew, a salad I'd made just in case someone dropped by. No one ever did. I closed it quietly and stood there for a moment, one hand on the counter to steady myself. The tile under my feet was cold. I looked around the room and tried to remember the last time it felt alive. There's a loneliness that comes not from being alone, but from being forgotten, from being taken for granted. You start to doubt your own memory. Did I do something wrong? Did I say something I shouldn't have? Was I too involved? Not involved enough? You comb through the past looking for the moment when the love shifted into tolerance. But there's never one moment. It's a slow erosion, a little less warmth each year, until one day you find yourself drinking tea alone and wondering when exactly your name stopped meaning home. I washed my cup and dried it slowly, letting the towel linger between my fingers. I thought about calling her, just to talk, just to hear her voice, but I knew how that would go. She'd answer with that distracted tone, kids screaming in the background, always in the middle of something. I'd end up feeling like an interruption in her day, not a part of it, and that I realized was worse than no call at all. So I didn't pick up the phone. I turned off the kitchen light, walked to the hallway, and stood in front of the photo of us, me holding her newborn, smiling like the world had just been made new. I touched the glass and whispered, "You used to need me." And then after a pause, "But I still needed you." The phone used to ring like clockwork on Sundays, around 10:15 in the morning, just after she finished her coffee, and before the kids began tugging at her sleeves. "Hi, Mom," she'd say with that sing-song voice that told me she was smiling. "How are you today?" We didn't always talk about anything important. Some weeks it was just weather or what groceries were on sale, but the sound of her voice had a way of stitching the days together, making the silence between them feel a little less hollow. I lived for those calls. I arranged my Sundays around them. I set the teapot to boil at exactly 10, so I'd have a warm mug in my hands when the voice I raised came through the receiver. And then one Sunday it didn't ring. I told myself she must be tired, that something came up, that she would call later. But Monday passed. Then Tuesday. I waited like a child waits for snow checking, hoping, convincing myself it was still coming. By the following Sunday, when the silence stretched again, I began to understand. I didn't want to, but some part of me did, because silence has a weight to it, a shape, and eventually you recognize its outline. She didn't forget. That's the part I held in my chest like a splinter. She didn't forget. She just didn't think it mattered. Maybe she thought I'd be fine. Maybe she thought I had enough going on at my age. Maybe she assumed I didn't need the sound of her voice like I used to. But that assumption that I didn't need her anymore was the worst kind of cruelty, because it came wrapped in convenience. If I didn't need her, then she didn't have to feel guilty. She didn't have to try. The weeks kept stretching. I stopped boiling the water. I stopped reaching for the phone, but I never stopped listening. Every creak of the floor, every mail truck idling outside, every faint buzz in the other room, I turned my head just for a moment, hoping it might be her. Some days I imagined she'd surprise me, show up with the kids, arms full of groceries, saying, "We missed you." Thought we'd cook dinner together. But she didn't. Not once. I started to wonder if it had always been this way, and I had just been too busy giving to notice I was receiving less and less. Like a candle burning from both ends, I kept offering warmth and light, not realizing the wax was running out, and once it did, no one thought to light another. I busied myself with little things, knitting projects, baking loaves. I froze instead of gifting, rearranging bookshelves no one else would see. I tried not to take it personally, but that's the thing about mothers we do. Because love, when it's unconditional, leaves you raw. You don't just give it, you live inside it. And when the echoes stop, you start to question if the silence means they've left, or if you were never really heard to begin with. I thought about writing her a letter, not angry, just honest. Something like, "I miss you. I still need to hear your voice. Just because I'm older doesn't mean I stopped being your mother." But I didn't write it. I was too proud, or maybe too afraid. Afraid that silence in return would hurt worse than anything she could say. Because when you give someone your heart and they choose not to hold it, it's not just neglect, it's abandonment. And abandonment from your own blood feels like being erased. I sat in my sunroom one morning with a cup of tea and a notebook I used to keep full of family recipes. Flipping through, I found the one she used to love, apple cinnamon muffins. She once told me they smelled like Saturdays. I made a batch that day, let the sugar and cinnamon fill the house, hoping it would bring back a piece of her. But it didn't. It only reminded me that the person who once called those muffins magic no longer called at all. I froze most of the batch, kept 2 on the counter. I told myself I'd eat 1 with my afternoon tea, but I didn't. They sat there until they went stale. I threw them out 3 days later, and it felt like burying something no one else knew had died. And that's when I finally said it out loud. She doesn't call, because she doesn't think I matter anymore. The words felt like vinegar on an open wound. But sometimes naming the pain gives it edges, and with edges you can begin to lift it. There are things I can still feel in these hands, soft and weathered, now joints, stubborn knuckles, slightly bent. But they remember. They remember the weight of her infant body pressed to my chest the day I brought her home from the hospital. How I cupped her tiny feet in my palm, marveled at their perfection. These hands rocked her to sleep when her cries pierced the night like glass. They spooned broth into her mouth when she was sick, braided her hair on school mornings, held her face when she was too heartbroken to speak after her first real loss. These hands learned 100 languages just to raise one girl. I stitched her clothes when we couldn't afford new ones, patched knees, sewed buttons. I can still see her maybe 8 years old dancing in that blue dress I made from scraps and hope. She called it her princess dress, didn't care that it had once been a set of curtains. In her eyes, I was magic. Everything I gave her sparkled because it came from love. I remember her telling her friends, "My mom can fix anything." And I did, or at least I tried. And now, years later, those same hands set plates for a family that never shows up, fold blankets for no one, knit scarves that sit in drawers. The same hands that once gave and gave now tremble slightly as they grasp a pen or reach for the phone that never rings. There's a kind of cruelty in how time turns the strong into fragile, how the mother becomes the afterthought, how the hands that once built a child's whole world are suddenly seen as meddling when they try to offer help. What they don't understand is that I don't help because I think they can't do it. I help because it's how I breathe. It's how I love. But But somewhere along the way, my love became inconvenient. My care started to feel like intrusion. The same woman who used to lean on me now sees me as an obligation, something to manage, schedule, tolerate. When she was pregnant with her first, she called me every day. Every craving, every fear, every strange kick, she came to me with it. Mom, is this normal? What if something goes wrong? Tell me again what labor feels like. And I told her, patiently, every time. I was there in the waiting room when her daughter arrived, pacing holes into the floor, praying under my breath. The moment they let me in, I cried. Not because I was tired, not because of the worry, but because I got to witness a new mother being born, and she was mine. I helped her learn to swaddle, to nurse to sleep in 10-minute increments. I held the baby so she could shower, cooked her meals, folded laundry, let her scream into my shoulder when the hormones became too much. I was her anchor then, just like I'd been before. And for a while I believed that meant something that couldn't be undone. But people change when comfort becomes habit. They forget the hands that carried them when they learn to walk on their own. They rewrite the past in softer pencil, making it easier to erase. And what I've realized is that you can raise someone with every ounce of yourself, body, mind, soul, and they can still turn away. Not out of hate, but out of convenience, out of distance, out of forgetting. It isn't always violent, this kind of betrayal. It's not a slap. It's not a slam door. It's the slow, unspoken shift when your calls go unanswered, when your advice is brushed off, when your presence becomes a footnote in a family you helped build. And yet, I still cook her favorite dishes from time to time, still find myself reaching for the phone when I see something I know would make her laugh, still keep a spare blanket in the guest room just in case she comes to visit, even though she never does. Love like this doesn't vanish even when it's neglected. It lingers, it waits, it aches quietly. I wish she could see what these hands remember. The years they held her, the things they built, the tears they wiped away. I wish just once she'd reach back for them, not because she needed something, but because she remembered where she came from. But wishes like that, I've learned, are best whispered into the dark. They're too fragile for the daylight now. It was a slip of the tongue that finally pulled the last thread loose. One I wasn't meant to hear, but life has a funny way of making sure you catch the things that hurt you most. I was helping clear the table after another strained visit, the kind where no one really talks. They just exchange pleasantries like borrowed coats stiff and ill-fitting. My granddaughter had just run off to play, and my daughter and her husband were in the kitchen, voices low, but not low enough. I know it's her house, he said, but if she doesn't need all this space, why can't we just talk to her about it? She's alone. It's not like she's using the whole thing. A pause, and then it'd make things easier for us. The school district here is better, and we'd actually have a yard. I didn't move. I just stood at the sink holding a wet plate, letting the water run over my knuckles like rain. The words were quiet, casual, said, like a budget plan or a thought about rearranging furniture. But to me it was thunder. They didn't even try to code it in concern. They didn't ask how I was doing, or if I ever felt lonely rattling around in this old house. No, they'd already skipped ahead to acquisition, like I was just holding space until they were ready to move in. And her silence, that's what broke me more than anything. She didn't defend me, didn't say, "That's her home, not ours to take." She just mumbled something vague, something small. Agreement or avoidance, I couldn't tell, but it wasn't a no. I should have seen it sooner. The way he always complimented the sunroom. The way she asked more than once how I managed the taxes. The comments about how much work it must be to live alone. I thought they were making conversation. I thought it was care. But it was calculation. It was never about me. They don't come to visit because they miss me. They come because they miss the idea of what I own. The space, the furniture, the safety net. They want the bones of the home I built, but not the woman who built it. I walked upstairs that night and stood at the doorway of each room one by one. The guest bedroom I painted lavender when she moved back in after the divorce. The attic, where old baby clothes are still folded in bins. The sewing nook, where I once taught her how to hem a skirt. Every corner of this house holds a part of me and a part of her too. Memories layered like dust clinging to the air. They see a house, I see a lifetime. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat on the porch instead, wrapped in my husband's old sweater, watching the stars. The night was so still it felt like the whole world was holding its breath. I let the cold settle into my bones. It made the ache familiar, something I could feel instead of suppress. And in that stillness, something in me hardened. I wasn't going to wait to be replaced. I wasn't going to stand by while the home I kept like a sanctuary was handed off like some unwanted inheritance. If I am too much for them to include, too inconvenient to be called, too burdensome to be respected, then they don't deserve the gifts of my life's work. I thought about all the ways I could have responded. Confrontation, argument, accusation. But none of those suited me. Not anymore. I've grown too tired for shouting, too old for scenes. Instead, I chose something quieter, something firmer, something they wouldn't see coming until it was done. The next morning, I opened my desk drawer and pulled out the folder. Inside were copies of the will I'd drafted years ago, still naming her as the sole heir. Back then, it felt like love. Now it felt like surrender. I ran my fingers over the edge of the paper, over the name that had once brought me nothing but joy, and I whispered, "No more." Because love isn't just giving. It's also knowing when to stop handing pieces of yourself to people who only want your shadow, not your light. The card had been sitting in the same drawer for years, tucked behind a stack of holiday stamps and an old sewing thimble I never used anymore. Yellowing at the corners, the ink slightly faded, but the name was still legible. Miriam Caldwell, estate attorney. She'd helped me and my husband draft the original will, back when everything still felt certain, when family meant unity and not calculation. Back then, revising our assets was a formality, something responsible people did. It never occurred to me that someday I'd revisit it alone, and with such a bitter clarity. I picked it up with shaking fingers, not from fear, but from the finality of the decision I knew was forming inside me. I'd always imagined the end of my life as a peaceful fade gently cushioned by the love of those I raised. I thought my home would be a place my grandchildren visited with joy, not because they had to. I thought my daughter would be the one holding my hand when my eyes grew too tired to see. But dreams don't always grow in the soil you tend. I sat at the kitchen table and stared at the card for what must have been an hour. The house was quiet, not the warm kind of quiet, but the kind that swells when meaning has left a place. I used to think of this silence as sacred. Now it felt like mourning. Calling Miriam was like lighting a match in a room soaked with memory. Her voice hadn't changed. Warm, efficient, softly professional. "Of course," she said. "We can update everything. You just let me know when." I scheduled the appointment for the end of the week, Friday morning. There was something poetic in choosing the end of the week. It felt like turning a final page before a weekend I wouldn't let be wasted. That night I pulled out the original documents, My daughter's name was everywhere listed as executor, inheritor, guardian of sentimental items. We had even marked out who would get which heirlooms: the brooch from my grandmother, the oak chest from my husband's study, the recipe journal I started at 18. So many items chosen with love. Now each name felt like an intrusion. I thought I might cry, but I didn't. My tears had already dried in other seasons. I was past mourning. What I felt now was resolve, a deep, ancient knowing that I had waited long enough for someone else to remember my worth. If they weren't going to, then I would have to do it for myself. I started writing a letter that night, something Miriam said wasn't legally necessary, but I wanted it anyway. Something to explain why. Not for my daughter, not for her husband, but for me. For the record, for the future, for the version of me who once believed she'd never be alone in this house. I wrote in long, looping cursive, careful and deliberate. This decision wasn't made in anger. It was made in reflection. After years of giving love freely, I now choose to give it intentionally. The legacy I leave is no longer a reward for obligation. It is a gift reserved for those who remembered me as more than a name on a deed or a warm meal at the holidays. I signed my name at the bottom firm, full, no hesitation. I read it 3 times before folding it neatly and slipping it into the envelope Miriam had given me years ago, the one I'd always thought I'd seal on my deathbed. Funny how life works. Sometimes the real ending isn't when you stop breathing, it's when you stop being seen. On Friday, I wore my best coat, the one I kept pressed and wrapped in tissue. Not for vanity, but for dignity. Because there's something about taking control of your own story that makes your spine sit straighter. I walked into Miriam's office with steps that felt like thunder, though no one noticed but me. The legal changes took less than an hour. A few signatures, a few notarized pages, and it was done. And when she asked me who the new beneficiaries would be, I paused. The answer came like a quiet breeze. I named someone who had shown me kindness in small ways, not a relative, not someone expecting anything, just a neighbor, a friend. A nurse's aide who brought me tea after I'd fallen once and stayed to talk even when her shift had ended. Someone who made me feel visible again. Because that's what this was all about, wasn't it? Visibility. Being seen, being valued, not for what I owned, not for what I could give, but for who I was, for who I still am. When I left the office, the sun was rising behind a layer of gray clouds, pale gold streaks breaking through, not dramatic, just enough to say, yes, it's a new day. I drove home slowly, let the radio play something soft. For the first time in a long while, I didn't dread going back to the empty house. It still creaked, still sighed in the same corners, but now it held something new, a truth spoken aloud. A woman remembered, a legacy reclaimed. It was a small piece of paper barely larger than a postcard, curling slightly at the edges from the weight of time and kitchen steam. Crayon lines danced across the page, wobbly flowers, a stick figure with a wide red smile, a heart in the sky. In the bottom corner, in uneven block letters, it said, "To Grandma, I love you more than pancakes." She had given it to me 2 years ago, I think, maybe 3. It had been a rainy afternoon, and I'd picked her up from preschool while her parents were at a meeting. She was soaked through from jumping in puddles, but beaming, holding that drawing like it was treasure. "I made this for you," she said, sliding it into my hands like it was gold. I remember I taped it up right then and there, crooked and proud, right on the fridge. That refrigerator, old humming, dented on the left side, had become a gallery of a time I didn't know I'd one day miss so much. That drawing, out of all the things in this house, was the only one I looked at every day. After the will was changed, I kept glancing at it, not in doubt, but in remembrance. Not everything in my life had faded into coldness. There were still flickers, still small, flickering lights that made my heart ache and swell at the same time. She was too young to understand the tides her parents had created, too innocent to see how love could be rationed, conditional, weaponized through absence. She still ran into my arms when she saw me, still buried her face in my cardigan and mumbled, "You smell like cinnamon." She still reached for my hand when we crossed the street, still asked for one more story at bedtime, still loved me without translation. I wondered more than once what would happen to that love as she grew older. Would it be taught out of her? Would the same walls that went up between her mother and me one day go up between her and the memory of what I had been to her? Would she forget my voice, the rhythm of my stories, the way I made stars out of ceiling stickers when she was too afraid to sleep in the dark? That thought frightened me more than anything, because that kind of forgetting isn't sudden, it's inherited, passed down through dismissive tones, avoided visits, hurried explanations like, "We'll see her another time," or "Grandma's just being dramatic." I feared she might one day believe that. But that drawing, it reminded me she hadn't yet. It reminded me that there was still one person in that family who saw me not as a burden or an obligation, but as Grandma, the warm lap, the patient voice, the safe place. So when I thought about what would happen to this house after I was gone, I found myself thinking not about my daughter or her husband, but about her, the little one who drew hearts in the sky, the one who still believed that a hug could fix anything, the one who loved me more than pancakes. I started writing her letters, one every week, not to be given now, but to be saved, to be found when she was older, when maybe the world tried to erase me from her memory. I'd be there, tucked away in envelopes, ink still breathing, telling her stories only I could tell, about the day she was born, the way she hummed in her sleep, the way her eyes lit up when I told her that stars listened. I filled pages with love, with lessons, with reminders. You were loved. You were cherished. You made me feel like I hadn't disappeared. I didn't need her to carry guilt. I only wanted her to carry truth. That drawing, though wrinkled, smudged, imperfect, was more valuable to me than anything in the will. It was proof. Proof that love had once flowed freely in this house. Proof that someone still remembered who I was beneath the silence and the distance. I thought about what to do with it, whether to leave it on the fridge forever or place it in the box with the letters. In the end, I did both. I scanned it, printed a copy, and tucked that into the stack of envelopes marked with her name. The original stayed on the fridge because I needed to see it. I needed that small reminder every morning that once upon a time love wasn't something I had to chase. It simply was. Maybe one day, long after I'm gone, she'll find those letters. Maybe she'll unfold the drawing and press it to her chest and remember the kitchen that smelled like cinnamon and wool. The house with creaky stairs and stories in the walls. Maybe she'll sit quietly and realize that she had a grandmother who loved her deeply, fiercely, without condition. And maybe, just maybe, that will be enough to keep that love alive. That Christmas, I wrapped my silence tighter than any gift beneath the tree. They invited me, of course, but with the same mechanical courtesy you offer a neighbor, not the warmth reserved for blood. I accepted anyway, not out of obligation, but because part of me wanted to see if they'd notice. If they'd notice how different I'd become, how much of me had quietly retreated. The house was festive enough. Tinsel looped around the banister, twinkling lights blinking along the windowsill, the artificial scent of cinnamon pumped from a plug-in by the door. Laughter bubbled up from the living room, where the kids were playing with new toys, and the grown-ups stood in pockets of conversation, balancing paper plates on one hand and wine glasses in the other. I arrived right on time, gift in hand, my best blouse under my winter coat. No one rushed to greet me, no arms opened wide, just a nod from my daughter and a distracted, "Oh, Mom, hi," as she waved toward the coat rack like I was one of the neighbors she barely knew. So I hung up my own coat. I set the gift gently under the tree. I greeted the children with smiles and kisses and tried not to notice how quick they were to turn away. They weren't being cruel, they were just being young, swept up in the noise and color and chaos of the day. But still, I remember when they used to cling to me, like ivy needing my every word. Dinner was buffet style, which meant no assigned seats. I chose a corner armchair and sat quietly nibbling at my plate, watching the room move around me. No one asked me questions. No one leaned in to hear my stories. I had become the background, a fixture of family folklore, more decoration than participant. And that's when I realized something. I was no longer trying to earn my place. I wasn't hurt, not like before. I had crossed some invisible threshold where pain became understanding, the kind of understanding that doesn't beg to be included anymore, the kind that simply observes and then folds inward, preserving what dignity remains. I watched my daughter laugh at something her husband said, her eyes soft and familiar, but not for me. I remembered when that gaze used to belong to me, before it was redirected, rewritten, rerouted. They didn't ask me about the scarf I had knitted. It was sitting on the end table unwrapped, still neatly folded bow untouched. I had spent 2 weeks on that scarf, each stitch, a memory, a soft echo of winters we once spent, curled under the same quilt, watching snow fall in silence. I knew she'd forget to take it home, and I let her. Because this time I wasn't going to chase acknowledgement. The conversation around me was light, inconsequential holiday plan sales at the mall, who got what from whom. I smiled where appropriate, nodded, sipped lukewarm cider, but I did not speak. Not about my memories, not about my year, not about the weight I'd carried silently since last Christmas. My silence wasn't meant to punish. It was my gift to myself, a protective shell I had finally earned. At one point, someone mentioned the house, my house, and how quaint it was. My son-in-law joked that they should Airbnb it. You know, he chuckled once Mom decides it's too much house for one person. I didn't laugh. My daughter nudged him gently, but said nothing in my defense, just a soft, embarrassed chuckle. I excused myself early, claimed a headache. My coat was still warm when I slipped it on. No one offered to walk me out. No one asked if I was okay. They were too busy opening one last gift, fighting over wrapping paper, retelling stories they hadn't invited me into. As I stepped outside, the cold met me like an old friend, honest, sharp, clarifying. The stars were faint behind the city lights, but I still looked for them. My breath rose in little clouds. The night smelled like frost and exhaust and pine. And when I got home, I didn't cry. I lit a candle, made myself a cup of tea. I looked around the living room, small and quiet and mine. The scarf I had made a copy of for myself was still draped over the arm of my chair. I pulled it around my shoulders and let the warmth sink in. There was peace in the silence this time, a kind of stillness that didn't ache like it used to. I had made my decision weeks ago. The will was changed, the future redirected, and tonight I felt no need to reverse it. Because at that table in that crowded room full of laughter and lights, I finally saw it clearly. I wasn't just forgotten. I was no longer needed. And that realization, though it came late, was a quiet kind of freedom. It came one evening, not through confrontation, not through a heartfelt talk, but as a whisper I was never supposed to hear. A forgotten phone left on the kitchen counter, still connected after the call had supposedly ended. I had come over at her request. My daughter had asked if I could babysit while they went to a dinner party. I said yes, of course. I always said yes, even when something inside me begged me to stop. The kids had gone to bed with little fuss. I had made them toast with honey, read them a story, tucked them in, just like I had done for her when she was small. The house was quiet, peaceful for once. I was folding laundry when I heard her voice drift from the phone on the counter. It was on speaker, still connected to whoever she had called after leaving the house. "She means well," my daughter was saying, "but sometimes it's just too much. You know, the way she talks, the way she hovers. She doesn't get boundaries. I just wish she'd back off a bit. It's exhausting." I stood frozen in the kitchen, her towel still warm in my hands. Too much. That was the phrase she used. Not kind, not thoughtful, not helpful. Just too much. Like love had a decibel level, and mine had become unbearable. Like I was water flooding a room that only wanted a sip. She laughed, then a soft laugh, and added, "I know she's getting older and I feel guilty, but honestly, she inserts herself everywhere, even when we don't ask." And the person on the other end, her husband, I presumed, agreed. "She means well," he said, "but this isn't the 1950s. We don't need her to raise the kids. She should just enjoy retirement or whatever." I put the laundry down, walked over to the phone, pressed the end call button with the gentlest touch I could muster. The screen went dark. The house again was still. I didn't say a word when they came home. I smiled, nodded, said everything went fine. I kissed my granddaughter's forehead once more before leaving. "Sleep well," I whispered, my voice catching. She smiled in her sleep, still innocent, still warm, still mine, even if only for a little while longer. But on the drive home, I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't hum. I didn't think. I just sat with the ache, dense and silent, sitting at the base of my throat like a stone. Too much. I repeated it to myself like a chant. Too much love, too much time, too much presence. It was how they saw me now, not as the woman who had poured her entire life into stitching theirs together, not as the hand that held their family's foundation through storms and sleepless nights, just excess, noise, clutter. You don't know what it feels like to be called too much until someone you raised says it with relief in their voice. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the chair by the window, the same one where I had once rocked her to sleep, tracing the grain in the wooden armrest, over and over, as though it could give me an answer I hadn't already heard. I kept thinking, what more could I have done differently? Where was the point? I stopped being a mother and started being a nuisance. Had I loved her too loudly, held her too closely, given too freely? But even those questions faded with the sunrise, because deep down I knew the truth. This wasn't about what I had done. It was about what they had stopped seeing. They stopped seeing the woman behind the casseroles, the school pickups, the last-minute babysitting, the quiet presence in the back of the room. They had stopped seeing me as someone whole, someone with a voice, a heart, a memory of who she was before she became grandma or mom or her. I was too much, because I still existed, because I had not gone quietly into the background. That morning I opened my journal and wrote only 3 words, no more apologies. I wouldn't apologize for loving too hard, for showing up, for remembering birthdays, for folding their laundry with trembling hands, for reading bedtime stories in voices that made the monsters go away. I would not shrink myself to fit the margins they left me in. I stood up, brewed myself a cup of strong black coffee instead of tea. It was bitter and bracing, but it woke something in me. A kind of clarity, a kind of spine. They called me too much. Good. That meant I had left a mark. The day came quiet gray and heavy with wind. Not stormy, just unsettled like the world itself was holding its breath. I woke before the sun brewed a pot of tea I didn't drink and sat in my robe longer than I meant to, fingers drumming against the kitchen table. I had already gone through the papers a dozen times, read and reread each clause, each name now crossed out, now replaced. I wasn't second-guessing. I just wanted to feel the weight of what I was doing. I owed that much to the woman I had once been, the one who had planned her family's future with such unwavering belief that love would be enough. It wasn't spite that brought me here. If anything, it was grief. Not the loud kind, not the kind people bring casseroles for. This grief lived quiet, under my ribs, settled into the bones stretched thin across the years. It was a grief that came from being slowly disappeared by the ones you raised. I dressed with care that evening, pressed slacks, a soft blouse the color of dried lavender, the cardigan my husband always liked. I fastened the little pearl earrings he gave me on our 25th anniversary. I wanted to feel like myself, not the ghost they had tried to turn me into. The lawyer's office was quiet, warm. Miriam offered me a kind smile as I sat across from her. "You're sure?" she asked gently. Her eyes held something between concern and admiration. I nodded. "I've never been more sure of anything," I said, and I meant it. The pen felt heavier than it should have, cool metal precise. As I leaned over the document, a hush fell over the room. Not silence exactly, but a kind of reverence, like the air itself understood what was happening. I signed my name slowly, first on the amendment, then on the new allocation of assets, then on the accompanying letter, the one that would be included with the will, the one that said in no uncertain terms that love and inheritance are not the same thing, that family isn't a blood contract, it's a choice. And when that choice is made only by one person, it begins to rot. Each signature felt like a stitch being undone. Not a tear, not destruction, just release, unraveling the old to make room for something that could finally breathe. When it was done, Miriam nodded. She slid the pages into a neat folder and said, "I'll file these first thing in the morning. You're protected. Everything is final." Final. The word echoed in my ears as I stepped outside. The sky was already dimming, that in-between hour where the light is neither gold nor gray. I stood on the steps for a while, letting the air press against my skin. People passed by on the sidewalk, couple students, someone walking a dog, but no one noticed me, and that was fine. For once, the invisibility was mine to choose. On the drive home, I didn't cry. I thought I might, but all I felt was calm. There's a quiet power in reclaiming something that was stolen slowly, like finding your reflection again after years of looking in mirrors where your face was always out of frame. When I pulled into the driveway, the porch light was glowing softly. I had left it on before I left habit, I suppose, a small kindness to myself. I stepped inside and took a deep breath, letting the air settle deep into my chest. This house, my house, felt different now, not because it had changed, but because I had. I walked room to room that evening, ran my fingers along the banister, straightened the framed photographs, not to impress anyone, but to honor what had been. I lit a candle in the living room, the one that smelled faintly of cedar and rose. I sat with my tea this time warm and watched the flame dance in the stillness. I thought about my daughter, not cruelly, just honestly. I wondered if she'd notice, if she'd feel the shift in the way some birds feel storms before the clouds even gather, or if the news would arrive like a thunderclap, an unexpected burst that demanded an explanation too late to give. And I thought about the woman I'd been for so long, the one who said yes when she wanted to say no, the one who gave and gave and gave again until her own hands were empty. I whispered to her that night, Not with regret, but with gratitude. You did your best, and now it's okay to rest. Because that's what the signing meant. It wasn't punishment. It wasn't vengeance. It was a lullaby for the parts of me that had waited too long to be held. It was a Tuesday when the phone finally rang, not the usual quiet hours when robocalls pester you about insurance, not the polite check-ins from old friends. This one came in the late afternoon just as I was bringing in the laundry, the sky softening into its pink-blue dusk. I nearly didn't answer. Something in me hesitated, as if I already knew what kind of voice would be waiting on the other end. Mom. Her voice was cautious, thinner than I remembered it, like she hadn't used it in a while, like it was being tested again for the first time. There was a pause long enough for me to sit down on the edge of the sofa and close my eyes. I knew what she'd say before she said it. I could hear it in the silence. I heard you updated the will. There it was. No greeting, no warmth, just the fact, the inconvenience of it laid bare. Yes, I said simply. I didn't offer explanation. I had no interest in filling the spaces she had left empty for so long. She was quiet again. I imagined her pacing, maybe looking for the right angle to come in at. Maybe she thought this was a conversation that could be negotiated. But I wasn't negotiating anymore. I had already paid more than enough in time and tenderness. I don't understand why. The question came wrapped in disbelief, like she genuinely couldn't fathom how we had arrived here. And in that moment, it struck me how blind she had let herself become, how easily someone can rewrite history in their own favor when they stop listening to the people who helped write it. You don't understand, I repeated, not as a question, but as a revelation. I mean, she stumbled. We've had our differences, but this, it feels extreme. I nearly laughed, not out of cruelty, but disbelief. Extreme, no, my dear. What was extreme was the silence, the dismissals, the half-hearted invitations, the holidays spent as an afterthought, the calls that never came, the dinners where I was invisible in my own chair, the way your husband referred to me as a problem we need to manage, and you said nothing at all. You made your choices, I said softly, and now I've made mine. But we're family, she whispered. I didn't reply right away. That word family had become so warped in her mouth. Not a bond, not a promise, just a claim, something to be wielded when convenient. She wanted the benefits of kinship, but not the responsibilities, not the care, not the seeing. Family, I said at last, is not just blood. It's how we choose to show up for each other. You chose absence, repeatedly. You made it very clear that I wasn't welcome, not in your home, not in your plans, not in your heart. And now I'm choosing peace. Her breath hitched, a small gasp like the start of a cry. But I didn't reach to soothe it. I'd done that too many times for a woman who no longer needed me until I said no. You could have talked to me, she said, her voice breaking. I tried, I said, in every way I knew how. Through food, through gifts, through silence, through staying, and none of it reached you. I didn't mean to make you feel unwanted, I interrupted gently. You didn't have to mean it. You just had to let it happen. And you did. Again and again. There was nothing more to say after that. She muttered something, maybe a goodbye, maybe nothing at all. The line went dead. I sat there for a long while, the receiver still in my hand, the room slowly returning to its usual quiet. And though I should have felt something regret, sorrow, some soft pang of remorse, I didn't. What I felt was calm, not vindication. Just clarity. She had called too late. Not because I no longer loved her. I will always love her in the way only a mother can. But love, when unanswered for too long, becomes memory. and memories like old photographs eventually fade at the edges. I stood and folded the last of the laundry. The scent of sun and wind still clung to the fabric. Outside, the sky had turned gold. A breeze pushed softly through the open window. I had done what needed to be done, and now I could breathe. I didn't change the will to punish her. That's not the kind of mother I am. I didn't do it to shock or shame or stir drama after I'm gone. No, the truth is far quieter, far sadder, and ultimately far stronger than that. I rewrote the will because I needed something to belong to me again. Something final, something that carried my name and my choices without being filtered through someone else's expectations. My whole life I gave. I gave without asking. I gave without being asked. I gave because that's how I understood love. Meals delivered to doorsteps. Children held in the dark of night. Calendars marked with everyone else's appointments, but never my own. I gave and gave and gave until I disappeared in the giving, until my needs became afterthoughts, or worse, obstacles. But something shifted when I picked up that pen. Something small at first, a flicker of self-respect, long buried under layers of polite smiles, and swallowed hurt. I realized I didn't have to spend the rest of my life waiting to be seen. I could decide to be seen by myself, by the paper, by the legacy I was shaping. When I signed that final page, it felt like planting a flag in ground I had spent decades tilling with bare hands. This was mine, not the house, not the heirlooms, me, my dignity, my story, my voice finally unmuted. They will be shocked, I'm sure. Perhaps there will be anger, perhaps confusion. They will go digging through old memories, looking for where they went wrong. Maybe they won't find it. Or maybe they'll find it everywhere, woven into every silence, every dismissal, every time they let me feel like a coat hung by the door, present, useful, forgotten. But by then it will be too late. And not because I sought revenge. I don't need their guilt. I don't need apologies delivered through gritted teeth or lukewarm letters after lawyers have done their work. I need peace. I need my final act to reflect the woman I'm not, the one they thought I should become, not the one who sat quietly nodding through backhanded compliments and long, aching silences. The woman I am is not bitter. She is clear. She has cried her last silent tears into her pillow at night. She has packed away the scarves and casseroles and perfectly timed phone calls that were rarely returned. She has stopped asking to be invited, stopped hoping to be remembered out of convenience. The woman I am has found her way home to herself. I walk through this house now not as a ghost, but as its rightful keeper. Every creaking floorboard, every chipped tile, every framed photograph, each piece has its place. Not because someone else sees it, but because I do. I sleep with the window cracked, and let the breeze remind me that I'm still here. I drink my tea warm. I sit in my chair with the sunrise and write letters, not out of longing, but of love, the kind I've turned inward at last. And in that quiet, in that stillness I once dreaded, I've begun to hear myself again. Not the version of me reflected back through someone else's disinterest. Not the shape I contorted into so they wouldn't flinch. Just me. And when I go, the world will not shake, but something will settle. A truth will land gently in the hearts of those willing to hold it, that love does not guarantee inheritance, that presence does not excuse absence, that sometimes justice is a paper signed in silence. Because in the end, I didn't need to raise my voice. I just needed to remember my worth. Now the nights are soft again, not empty, just quieter. I light a candle before bed, not out of ritual, but comfort. The flame dances for no one but me. I tuck myself in, slowly grateful for the stillness that once felt like punishment, but now feels like grace. Outside, the wind rustles through the trees, that low, tender hush that sounds like a lullaby written by the earth itself. I listen to it, breathing it in, letting it sweep through the last of the rooms inside me that once held ache. Sometimes I still remember the laughter, the smell of cinnamon at Christmas, the weight of small arms around my neck. I don't banish those memories. I let them drift in like birds through open windows, stay as long as they need, then fly off without clutching my chest. They are not ghosts. They are reminders that I love deeply and well. And now, I rest in that. I rest in knowing I gave all I could, that I made the hard choice not to punish, but to preserve something that had nearly been lost me. If they come around one day, I will greet them with calm eyes and a steady voice. If they don't, I will still rise each morning and find joy in my own breath, my own hands, my own presence. The story isn't tragic. It is simply true, and there is peace in truth. Some endings are just beginnings with the noise turned off. I gave them silence, and in it, I found peace.